Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about the 1987 election, which of course led to an historic third term for Margaret Thatcher. It's an election in which she wins a majority of 102 seats, despite only winning a plurality of the vote. So why look at this election? Well, first of all, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that Margaret Thatcher would win. If we look at the polls between 1983 and 1987, all three of the parties that are competing in this election, the Conservative Party, the Labour Party and the SDP Liberal Alliance, all of them at some point in that period actually have a lead in the polls. So it's not immediately obvious who will win, although it's fair to say that once the election is called, the Conservative Party have a substantial lead. Key question in this election is whether Labour, following the 1983 election, which had been an historically bad election, the worst election result for them since 1918, whether they'd be able to firmly establish themselves as the principal opposition to the Conservative Party on the centre-left, following the emergence of the alliance between the SDP and the Liberal Party. Okay, so what's the context of the election? So Neil Kinnock is elected to replace Michael Foot. Kinnock is regarded as being on the soft left of the party, but he quickly establishes himself as somebody who wants to take on the militants in his own party and move the Labour Party towards the centre ground of British politics. Mrs Thatcher's second term is not without controversy. There is a long and bitter strike where the miners go on strike in 1984 to 1985 and the print workers go on strike in Wapping in 1985 to 86. So it's not a period that's absent the present of industrial dispute, and both strikes proved extremely divisive. And in 1986 the Westland affair, which was a squabble over funding for a troubled British helicopter manufacturer, leads to the resignation of two cabinet ministers, Michael Heseltine and Leon Britton. So there were significant issues for the Thatcher government during this period. But what's also true about this period is that inflation falls to 4%, unemployment falls below 3 million for the first time, and the economy does relatively well. So there's lots of people, therefore, who benefit from this period of Conservative government and therefore are willing to vote for Mrs Thatcher for a third term. So what happens in the election? Well, first of all, the Conservative Party run a fairly traditional centre-right campaign. They focus on low taxes, on the economy, and on defence. As I've just said, inflation had fallen, unemployment was falling, and therefore the Conservative Party wanted to emphasise their strong economic record. They also wanted to emphasise Labour's weakness, particularly on the issue of defence, and there was a famous election poster with the title Labour's Policy on Arms, and it depicted a soldier with his hands in the air as if he was surrendering. By contrast, the Labour campaign focused on Kinnock himself. The first party political broadcast for the Labour Party during this campaign focused on Kinnock the man. They wanted to portray him as a family man, as an ordinary guy, but also as somebody that cared deeply about the country that he wanted to run, and somebody who wanted to challenge the left of his own party, the so-called militant tendency, who'd infiltrated the Labour Party and were trying to move the party to the left.
I'll tell you what happens with impossible promises. You start with far-fetched resolutions. They are then pickled into a rigid dogma, a code. and you go through the years sticking to that, outdated, misplaced, irrelevant to the real needs, and you end in the grotesque chaos of a Labour council hiring taxis to scuttle around the city, handing out redundancy notices to its own workers. I'll tell you, and you listen, I'm telling you, you can't play politics with people's jobs and with people's services.
Now, this presidential-style campaign messaging in this election advert immediately helped Kinnock's personal ratings on the day after the broadcast happened. Kinnock's personal approval ratings went up by 16 points overnight. Labour also, in this campaign, criticised the government's record on unemployment, which remained persistently high, and on bad NHS waiting lists. So this is the Labour Party trying to position themselves where they're strong. They recognise that unemployment and the National Health Service are going to be salient issues, and they're also issues where Labour traditionally have a lead over the Conservatives. So they're trying to move the election onto territory that's good for them. And as I've said, Labour also wanted to highlight the fact that Kinnock was taking on the left of his own party. Kinnock was widely thought to be a competent leader, particularly in relation to Michael Foot, and the election campaign was much more professional in '87 compared to the relatively shambolic campaign in '83 when Michael Foot was leader. It was led by people like Philip Gould and Peter Mandelson, who would go on to be advisors, key advisors, and indeed, in the case of Mandelson, a minister in Blair's New Labour government. And actually, the public agreed with this assessment. They thought that, when asked the question, they thought that Neil Kinnock had ran a better campaign than Mrs Thatcher by 40% to 37%. So not a very strong opinion, but still, they thought that he'd ran a better campaign. However, when asked who would make the better Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher had a clear lead of 10 percentage points. She led 42% to 32%. Labour was the preferred party on the issues that mattered, though. Now, this is interesting. So the four salient issues in this election were unemployment, the National Health Service, education, and national defence. And on 3 of the 4 of those issues, people trusted Labour more than they did the Conservatives. Now that tells us that if the election was just about the issues, the Labour Party would have won. And so we need to maybe look elsewhere for reasons why the result went the way that it did. Now, one possible reason is found when we look at the media during this campaign. The Labour Party only had the support of 2 newspapers, the Daily Mirror and the Guardian. And if you've watched my videos up until this point about the 79 election and the 83 election, this won't surprise you very much. And it won't surprise you also to hear that the right-wing press support the Conservative Party overwhelmingly. So the Sun, the Mail, the Express, the Telegraph and the Times all back the Conservative Party, with the Independent remaining neutral. Just to give an example of the vitriol directed at Neil Kinnock, one prominent Sun headline was "Why I'm Backing Kinnock" by Stalin, trying to emphasise the fact that, well, at least from the perspective of the Sun newspaper, Kinnock was somebody that hadn't moved his party successfully away from the far left. So what was the result? Well, the Conservatives, as we know, were returned to government. They lost 21 seats, leaving them with 376 members of Parliament and an overall majority of 102. So a very, very substantial majority, higher than the majority that they first came into office with in 1979, but lower than the majority that they won at the 1983 election of 143. For the Labour Party, well, they came in a strong second place, I want to say. So they weren't close to the alliance. There's a gap of 8 percentage points between the two of them, between Labour and the alliance. So the Labour Party got 30.8% of the vote, and the alliance got 22.6% of the vote. So a significant gap between them. And therefore Labour did manage to cement themselves as the principal party on the centre-left opposing the Conservative Party in future. But because the left remained split, despite the fact that between the two of them they win over 52% of the vote, because they're split, the Conservative Party win with a plurality of the vote. Now, where Labour do win support, it tended to be in areas where they were already strong. So Labour won support in areas of the country like the north east of England, for example, where they really didn't need the votes, but they increased the size of their majorities in the north east of England. Whereas in the south, and in London in particular, they actually lost ground and lost some seats in London to the Conservative Party. The election was relatively disappointing for the alliance. Obviously, they've slipped back. There's a net loss of 1 seat, and a former leader of the SDP, Roy Jenkins, loses his seat. Now, this leads eventually to the two parties merging to become what we now call the Liberal Democrats. Also prominent in this election, it feels quite late for this to be happening actually, but in 1979, the election of the first black members of Parliament happens with the election of Diane Abbott, Paul Boiting, and Bernie Grant. Okay, so we get a historic milestone in this election, albeit coming very, very late. So why did the Conservatives win? Well, there are obviously several explanations. Perhaps the most prominent explanation is put forward by Dennis Kavanagh and David Butler in their very influential study of the 1987 election. And essentially they say that the reason the Conservatives won is that there were enough people who had benefited from the economic policy changes that they'd made, from the fact that the economy had been growing during the period, to create a set of people who were willing to back the Conservative Party. Remember, they only need a plurality of voters to secure a majority of seats, especially given the fact that the left's divided. So there's one explanation. Second explanation, well, the Labour Party is still divided in this period, with Kinnock seeing the need to take on the militant tendency who'd infiltrated the Labour Party. And perhaps there was a perception generated partly by the press, partly by the Conservative campaign, and partly by some of the reality, that Kinnock had not successfully moved his party far enough to the centre ground. And that's certainly how Kinnock would see it, because he then, following the election, he remains leader. Relatively unusual for the leader not to resign, but he remains leader, and he leads the party further towards the centre ground into the 1992 election. And finally, and I emphasised this last time, and I emphasise it again, the electoral system needs to be mentioned as a factor here. After all, it's clear from the result, as it was clear from the result in 1983, that a majority of the country didn't want a Conservative government. Only 42.2% of people voted Conservative, and whilst that is a high number, it's very rare for the winning party to win an overall majority in terms of the percentage of the vote. In fact, the last time that happened was 1931, and those were quite unusual circumstances, electing Stanley Baldwin as Prime Minister of a national government. Still, the electoral system rewards the Conservatives with a very large majority of 102 seats, despite the fact that they win a plurality of the vote. And a big part of the reason for that is that the left, the centre-left in the country, remains split between the Labour Party and the Alliance. And that remains a problem all the way up until today for those who would seek to win power on a left-wing platform. of course, is something that in the modern day Keir Starmer continues to struggle with. So that concludes matters. 1987 leads to the victory, third term in office for Margaret Thatcher. She subsequently is forced to resign by resignations in her cabinet and by a leadership election that for her goes wrong. John Major becomes Prime Minister, and Neil Kinnock continues to modernise the Labour Party, continues to move to the centre ground, and we have the 1992 election where Kinnock is very much expecting to win, but there is a surprise result. The exit poll is wrong on election night, and John Major wins with a small majority. More about that next time.